You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
You're listening to the Rock Art Podcast. Join us every week for fascinating tales of rock art, adventure, and archaeology. Find our contact info in the show notes and send us your suggestions.
Welcome back, everyone. This is Dr. Aaron Garfinkel. We're recording our number 137th episode of your Rock Art Podcast. And we're proud and blessed to have Dr. Aaron Wright, preservation archaeologist with Archaeology Southwest, and he's on board. Welcome.
It's great to be with you, Alan.
Yeah, I'm familiar a little bit with your work, but not much with you as a person or have much background about your current endeavors. The way I usually kick this off is I ask you to sort of give us a synoptic autobiographical portrait, perhaps, of how you got involved with this field and this endeavor and what created a passion for the subject matter of anthropology, archaeology, Native American studies, etc. Floor is yours, Aaron.
Absolutely. Happy to engage here. So I'm originally from southern Ohio on the muddy banks of the Ohio River. And, as a young person, I was enamored with the mounds. This is Hopewell and Adena area. And mounds were all over my hometown. They were in people's parking lots, backyards, etc. And so we were really fascinated with the subject. But interestingly, there was a lot of mystery and mystique about it because there are no contemporary federally recognized tribes in the area. So it fosters these sort of narratives of disappearance and collapse and things like that. Had a lot of curiosity as a young person, went to college, didn't know you could do archaeology or anthropology as a profession. I went in as a philosophy major, took about 1/4 of classes in that and found out that was not for me. My second quarter, I took an introduction to world prehistory class, and my instructor was actually a graduate student whose background was in cultural resource management. And we learned about there is actually an industry for this line of work. And so I had a career reversal, or maybe not a reversal, but a clarity of what I wanted to do with my life. And so I went through the undergraduate program. And about a year after that, I moved to New Mexico and took my first job in cultural resource management.
Where were you employed?
I shovel bummed it. So I worked for a number of companies. The first one was Southwest Archaeological Consultants, I believe, out of Santa Fe. And then I worked for Statistical Research and Four Corners DRG Research, mostly in New Mexico. Realized that I couldn't really advance my career beyond sort of a field crew chief position without a graduate degree. So I went to graduate school after 5 years of that and got interested in rock imagery at a graduate school level.
Now, you received a Ph.D. from an academic university, didn't you, sir?
Yeah, I did. My master's degree was at Washington State University. I studied paleoclimatology and its impacts on human migration in the Southwest.
Wow.
And as I was kicking around a PhD topic at Washington State University, an opportunity came up in Phoenix, a fellowship with the Center for Desert Archaeology to do a dissertation project on the petroglyphs at South Mountain Park in Phoenix, south side of Phoenix. It's a follow-up to Todd Boswick's popular book, Landscape of the Spirits. Mm-hmm. So I applied for the fellowship and got it, and I got the approval of my academic committee. And so I spent 4 years inventorying, studying, writing about the petroglyphs at South Mountain Park, the Hohokam petroglyphs, and published a book through the University of Utah Press on my dissertation. And that came out in 2014. My dissertation was 2011.
Fabulous. What an interesting story, and what some remarkable opportunities that were available to you.
Yeah, it was a really good opportunity that the Center for Desert Archaeology provided. And that organization changed their name about a decade ago to Archaeology Southwest. And that's the place I'm still working. And so I've been able
to... As I understand it, they're a nonprofit, are they?
That's right. We're a 501c3 nonprofit, and our mission is to explore and protect heritage places while honoring their diverse values. And we do that, traditionally we've done that through, we envision like a stool, and we have 3 legs. One is research, of course. The other 2 are actual conservation and outreach. And a few years ago, we added a 4th leg to the stool, and it's advocacy. And so we advocate strongly for tribal sovereignty in the realm of cultural resource heritage.
Well, that's fabulous. That sounds like a very unique and wondrous organization. How do they fund themselves?
We have a pretty diverse funding portfolio, a lot of grants. We have a foundation. We do very, very small contracts for most of our work. We do have some rather large arrangements with the Bureau of Indian Affairs for Archaeological Resource Protection Act efforts. So it's a diverse portfolio, but it basically allows us to do what we want to do for the right causes and build relationships with similar organizations and tribes.
Yeah, very, very interesting. I've been involved with nonprofits for about, the last 10 to 15 years here in California. And I don't believe there's really anything parallel in California that has the mission or the particular, funding base as your organization.
Yeah, we occupy a unique niche, and I think it's that flexibility that has really allowed us to not just survive, but thrive.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think your mission in terms of associating with Indigenous people, Native Americans, and as an advocacy organization and connecting with those entities that could assist you and vice versa is absolutely critical, especially given sort of the radically and changing political geography in terms of dealing with Native Americans, as you're probably well aware.
Absolutely. It's just made us a stronger, better organization to accomplish our mission. And it's, obviously it's the right thing to do.
Now, you've done work in California as well as in the Great Basin, the American Southwest. When I say you, I'm talking about, of course, your organization.
As far as I'm aware of, we've not done any work in the Great Basin or any work in California proper. I've done some writing and some overview work related to the Hohokam National Monument. Yeah, which is straddles Great Basin, California deserts. And then Patayan culture history is an area of interest of mine and research. And so I incorporate information, literature from the Colorado Desert, Colorado River Valley, but I haven't actually not done any field work in California.
Well, it's interesting you talk about the Patayan because the California Rock Art Foundation, which I was a part of for many years, but have recently relocated my expertise to another native-run 501c3. We received contracts with the National Park Service to do National Register nominations on several sites that were in the extreme eastern Mojave Desert. That would be probably in part the Colorado River tribes would have been associated with their creation, including, a Patayan or, the Eastern Mojave Desert traditions that you're aware of, both with being the groups that were associated with those kind of areas that were along the Colorado and also overlapped into Arizona and the American Southwest.
Right.
Yeah.
Places like Grapevine Canyon?
Yeah, places like Grapevine Canyon, but also all the way into a place called Hole in the Wall, another place called Mary's Cave. And these are archaeoastronomical sites, as well as places along the Mojave Trail that the Mojave trader travelers would have used as stops along their route to the coast and back. Yes. Yeah. So we did a rather extensive research and background on that. I'll have to share that with you offline sometime. Yeah, but please. I think you'd find that of some interest.
Absolutely.
Please continue. Yeah. So tell me about your latest work and the direction your career is taking you now?
Well, I'm managing a number of projects right now. I run a pretty intensive field program because I have still have the capacity to do it, even though I'm pushing middle age. So I run a robust field program during the seasons when it's possible. A lot of folks volunteer for me. I hire tribal members when I can. Obviously, want to compensate them justly.
Are you able to still run those field programs on indigenous sites, things that we might call prehistoric archaeological sites, or is that not possible?
No, it's absolutely possible on federal lands, and of course, private lands. Obviously, there's permitting and there's permitting processes, and there's tribal authorization processes that agencies implement. So it's possible as long as you have the approval and authorization of the relevant parties.
Yeah.
So still able to do these are all non-invasive projects. So we don't do excavation. It's antithetical to our mission.
Sure.
So, we value archaeological places because they exist, not because they're dug up.
And so all of your work would be involved with mapping, documentation, other sorts of creative ways to gather information without being destructive.
Yeah, it's what most folks would call an archaeological survey, although it's quite intensive and it's beyond. We go beyond the objective of just identifying archaeological sites. So there's an active research component, and we collect information that helps us address the questions we have and the questions that tribes have as well. So I'm finishing up a multi-year project on the lower Gila River, which is this interchange between Hohokam and Patayan, archaeology and O'odham and human ethnohistory. And that was a pretty intensive field project. It was funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities. I was able to hire 7 tribal employees throughout the course of that. So I'm finishing up that project, and we'll probably be publishing on that the rest of my life. Our first
sounds familiar, Doctor.
Our first peer-reviewed piece from that just came out in a book I recently edited called Sacred Southwestern Landscapes.
Wow.
So it's a paper.
Congratulations.
Thank you. It's a chapter all about the concept of Patayan dreaming and its relationship to the archaeological record.
Fabulous.
I'm involved in a project of inventorying indigenous trails across the Great Bend of the Gila. And what's really interesting about this project is we can't see the actual trails. What we're mapping are these very extensive linear artifact scatters that approximate the trail corridors through these mountain ranges.
Well, let's stop there, because it sounds like we're getting into something that's of great interest to our listenership and to me as well.
Sure.
Catch you on the flip-flop, gang. Well, welcome back, gang. We're here at your Rock Art Podcast, episode 137. We're here with Dr. Aaron Wright, preservation archaeologist with Archaeology Southwest. And Aaron was just beginning to talk about some of his active research projects. Go ahead, Aaron, please.
Sure. So the Trails project that we're working on, we've been involved in it for about 7 years, intermittently, but intensively the last 2 years. And it was really sprung out of the roots of previous work by a colleague, Andrew Darling, who worked at the Gila River Indian community in the early 2000s. And he partnered with Barnaby Lewis, who was the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer at the time. And they began to try to tie O'odham travel narratives, song cycles that describe traveling throughout the landscape to sacred places, etc. And it's trying to align them with actual on-the-ground trail manifestations. They were able to map a few trail segments cutting across what we call the Great Bend of the Gila. It's where the Gila River takes this pretty large turn to avoid some mountain ranges. And the indigenous communities would cut across that stretch of the bend to shorten their travel time along the river. And once you get into the interior of the mountains, you can't see the trail alignments anymore. But what we found about 7 years ago is that if you keep mapping the artifacts, you can extend these trails many, many miles beyond where the trail is no longer visible. And so for 2 years, we've been intensively mapping this elaborate trail network. We've got about 80 miles mapped. And it's just more and more fascinating the more we do it, because these trails just grow, they branch, and they head into places that didn't seem obvious at first, but once you see where they're going, it makes absolute sense. And really what we're doing is we're providing on-the-ground, I guess, justification or verification of art and oral histories about connections across broad landscapes. Landscapes that reach far beyond their current reservation boundaries. And it's just another way the archaeological record reminds us, or can remind us if we're willing to listen to it, that tribes are still here. The tribes occupied all of continental North America. The reservation boundaries today are gross misjustifications for what were once tribal territories and should be considered tribal homelands today. So that project is, we have a few more months on that project. That's a project that you could spend the rest of your life working on, because the trails just keep going. They just do not stop.
Now, a question about those trails.
Yeah.
Could you share at least some of the significant places that those trails may have connected to, or that were recognized by Native people? Spiritual places, holy places, or other significant locations that are found along those trails?
I can share what I know. It's obviously not comprehensive because I don't have that cultural knowledge. The trails essentially move between settlements on the Gila River, if you take them to their extreme extents within the scope of where we're working. Beyond that, they go to other important places. But between those settlements, as people go through the mountains, it's pretty obvious to me, and I hope to demonstrate at some point in the future through some publication, that significant mountains are guiding forces, if you will. The trail, when you're walking these trail alignments, you are clearly walking towards prominent mountain peaks. And as soon as the trail starts to veer into another direction towards where it's ultimately going, your vista is dominated by another important peak. And these peaks, but for contemporary people today, contemporary indigenous people, these peaks have importance, significance, names, etc. And what I've written in the past, in that Sacred Landscapes volume, I have another chapter where I talk about basically Hohokam attachments to sacred mountains. And so it's no surprise to me, at least, that these mountains are not only visual anchoring points to guide people, because the song cycles that we know of name landforms that are in the sequence as one would travel the trails. But they're also guiding forces, if you will, because this is a dangerous terrain. There's no water, and it would have been a pretty daunting experience to travel across the Great Bend of the Gila on foot with a canteen or two of water. And we find the broken canteens all the time. Those are the sherd alignments that we're following, are basically all these broken water bottles that people deliberately, accidentally dropped. And then we encounter sacred points along these trails, and they're in strategic locations. They're creating patterns that help us better interpret them and understand them when we find them in other contexts.
When you find these sacred places, what are the physical archaeological manifestations of those sacred places, if any?
They generally seem to an average observer, they would seem to be subtle, maybe insignificant to the common person, but they're rock features, rock piles, rock rings, variations of that sort. In some places, ground figures, so rock alignment ground figures, cleared circles, and of course petroglyphs. And these things.
Now, do you ever find, or if there is available to them, caches or scatters of white quartz?
Yes and no. So I've not yet encountered caches of white quartz, but we find flaked white quartz all the time.
Okay.
White quartz outcrops in this environment naturally,
Mm-hmm.
but we're finding the cores and the flakes along these trail alignments. And lithics are a very small part of the trail assemblage. It's 99% ceramics.
Mm-hmm.
Lithics mixed, but the lithics that we do find they're odd and they're hard to explain why they're on a trail alignment. These quartz cores are part of that sort of a question, I guess.
Well, that would make perfect sense in my mind in terms of the supernatural or spirituality of those trails, and because of the power associated with those quartz materials. And you're aware of that, right?
Yes.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah.
Please continue.
Well, we also find petroglyphs along the trails.
And what images are represented on the petroglyphs, or if they are any representational or even abstract?
Both on this project and previous projects I've worked on involving trails in southern Arizona, the iconography on trail alignments is not discernibly different from a statistical perspective from the iconography found in other contexts. But what is represented it would be the standard suite of Hohokam, or what people have called Gila style iconography: spirals, squiggly lines, circles, anthropomorphic forms, lizard-like forms. That is the predominant assemblage. Every now and then there'll be maybe a quadrupedal form, amorphous shapes, etc. But telltale Gila-style iconography on these trail alignments. Farther west on the Gila, where I've worked previously, you're moving into Patayan territory, and there are, of course, similarities there with Hohokam or Hohokam iconography, but it's unique in itself. And so what I'm getting at is that as far as I've been able to discern, both subjectively and objectively through quantification, is that the iconography is not different along the trails.
Do you see connections with the Patayan or Mojavean expressions in California and in Nevada, being the H's or those encircled crosses, things along those lines?
Oh, yes. We find those all along the lower Gila River. Once you get west of the Phoenix Basin, we find them throughout the deserts north of the Gila. So the thinking of like the Eagle Tail Mountains and the Kofa Range in southern Arizona. And that's essentially you do a triangle between the Colorado River and the Gila River.
Yeah.
And the hypotenuse, it's basically that area in between. And there's indigenous trail corridors all through there that connected the lower Colorado to the lower Gila, and that's all Patayan country.
Of course.
And basically it's Peeposh settlements on the Gila, Mojave and Quetzan settlements on the Colorado, and Halchadome settlements on the Colorado. And so we find grapevine-style iconography as far east as the Eagle Tail Mountains, and that grapevine style is pretty localized to the Mojave territory. So it's not surprising to know that Mojave people have, the Eagle Tail Mountains and that area factors prominently into Mojave oral history.
Perfect. Yeah, it makes sense. Do you find connections at all, long-term connections or relationships that have been represented between the Great Basin, the American Southwest, Mesoamerica, anything along those lines in your research?
The archaic iconography of the Southwest is, so far, we can't distinguish it from anything in the Great Basin. And so it's that broad, however you want to call it, I guess the Western archaic tradition. Mm-hmm. I suspect with some robust investigation and concerted effort, we could possibly tease out sort of regional nuances. But So far, it's basically the same as far as we can tell, which speaks to obviously broad systems of social interaction and relation across vast areas. The Hohokam iconography, interestingly, and it was really first observed in ceramic iconography, but it extends into the rock imagery. The earliest Hohokam iconography is consistent with Western archaic tradition iconography.
Mm-hmm.
And so we've used it as a line of evidence to support the indigeneity of Hohokam or Hohokam populations for a long time, and it's still commonly discussed. There was this interpretation that Hohokam was a Mesoamerican migrant community.
Right.
And that's contrary to indigenous thought and oral histories and ways of understanding. And archaeology has now shown that, and the rock imagery is part of that, has shown that that's really a misconception, or it's at least a lot more complex than that.
Sure. Has there been genetics that has spoken or investigated that particular relationship, or no?
No. I mean, there's obviously the ethical issues around that, but for Hohokam or Hohokam archaeology, the predominant means of interment was cremation. And so we just don't really have the ability, I guess, to do those sorts of studies.
Well, let's call it a wrap for this second segment. Excellent. And we'll pick it up in the final. Thank you for a fascinating tale. See you on the flip-flop, gang. Welcome back, gang. It's segment 3. We're here at the Archaeology Podcast with Aaron Wright, Professor Wright, Dr. Wright from Archaeology Southwest. And he's been sharing his journey in archaeology, anthropology, and working with Native people. And I think he wants to move along in that particular realm and talk a little bit about the collaborative efforts that they have done with Native people. Go ahead, Aaron.
Absolutely. So organizationally, Archaeology Southwest has moved into and really prioritized the concept of tribal collaboration. And what that means is we seek to partner with tribes in everything that we do. And each project looks a little bit different. Tribes, if you work with tribal historic preservation officers, you probably understand that they're overworked, understaffed. And so there's a capacity issue involved. But tribal collaboration can look different ways and will inherently look different ways because you'll be working with different tribes in different places on different projects for different reasons. But organizationally, it really kicked off for us about a decade ago with the Bears Ears National Monument effort, which we were tangentially involved in, and then our long-term effort for the Great Bend of the Gila National Monument, and where we actually partnered with tribes on trying to promote legislation to establish the national monument. And that's where my work with tribes really began and has grown since. And I try to prioritize tribal involvement throughout every phase of my research, from conception through publication. And sometimes that's having co-authors on my papers who are, representatives from, acknowledged representatives from their tribes. Obviously, there's a lot of meetings. There's a lot of backdoor discussions. It's about developing relationships with people. And it goes beyond transactions. And it's been quite rewarding in many regards. And with rock imagery, it's incredibly relevant to work with tribal people. And I often think back on Julian Stewart. Folks may be aware of him and his work. In 1929, he published a pretty seminal piece with the petroglyphs of California and adjoining states. And I believe he was still a graduate student at the time. And it was a really exciting endeavor and investigation, looking at broad comparisons and ideas. And 7 years later, in a report to the Smithsonian Institution, he basically wrote that studying rock imagery was a dead end because nobody knew what it meant. Even the native people didn't know what it meant. And if they told you what they meant, they were just making it up. And so that I found that incredibly discouraging. I still find it discouraging. And I think Stewart was wrong. I also think he was incredibly misplaced by assuming that tribal communities would tell him what the symbols meant. I believe Stewart was misplaced in his perspective that the only type of research we could do was try to interpret the imagery. The type of research I do with rock imagery, I don't even attempt to do that. I defer to my indigenous colleagues to do that because that's their domain, that's their area of specialty. I don't have the authority or the privilege to try to tell anybody what a symbol means, but I have a capacity as an archaeologist and anthropologist to study them in a different way, to study them as patterns and distributions and things like that. And we've been able to learn a lot about rock imagery if we divert our attention from trying to interpret the imagery to trying to understand it in cultural contexts and in landscape contexts. And so I think Stewart was really just not, and it was obviously a long time ago, and archaeology's come a long way, but I think he was pretty narrow-minded in that. But then also, when we model the number of petroglyphs on landscapes relative to the population levels that those landscapes once supported, it's apparent that very few people ever made petroglyphs. For the South Mountains, for instance, our model came out to 3 to 7 glyphs per year. Not per person, but per year, really. And so that's pretty eye-opening. And that could help explain why some people don't know what the symbols are or can't speak to that. But then also, this is sacred knowledge behind this iconography, and to assume that Native peoples are just going to divulge that information to anyone, let alone an anthropologist, it's presumptuous. And so I'm digressing perhaps from the question here, but I think if we can really make progress, if we really respect the basically sovereignty, tribal sovereignty over certain dimensions of what we do and what we study, and also what we say and how we say it. And they have to be involved in this research if our research is going to have any sort of substance or impact or meaning. And, the rock imagery is so really tailored for tribal collaboration. In my line of work, it's one of the few dimensions of the archaeological record where people get excited. Both tribal and non-tribal people. It's such an engaging subject. And in the indigenous communities that I work with really enjoy the rock imagery sites and seeing the rock imagery sites and talking about the rock imagery sites. So it's just a great portal into developing those relationships, fostering those relationships, generating respect, developing trust, all those things that are important in what we do.
Absolutely. I have to concur. I think that rock art, in some ways, is some of the most interesting and compelling data sets that archaeologists have to work with. And, talks to us at so many different levels simultaneously in terms of research questions. Issues of relationships and territoriality and subsistence and settlement and cosmology, all are, sort of concatenated in these pictures that are preserved on rock. And I think archaeologists have had a hard time, at least it's been an uphill fight in California, I don't know if that's the same way in the Southwest, trying to gain respect from our colleagues in terms of doing research in the area of rock art and demonstrating its value as a research tool, as a data set. Have you found that's a bit different in your neck of the woods?
I think we have a whole episode there, Alan, that we could go into.
Sorry to open up a can of worms, but it just kind of came to me.
I have a lot of thoughts and opinions on this specific subject, having gone through a graduate program with a
yes.
dissertation.
Sure.
I can only speak from my experience. I've been told, going through graduate school and sharing some of the feelings I was having on this exact subject.
Yes.
I was advised by my mentors that it's much easier now than it was, and you can probably relate, or it's a more accepted branch of the discipline than it once was. So I appreciate that, but we still have miles to go.
Yes, I agree.
I chalk it down primarily to institutional bias and these cycles of universities producing progeny of the faculty who go on to be faculty members. And so we get this regurgitation of research interest, and in this case, I would call it research bias against rock imagery. And so folks that actually go and do good quality rock imagery research, they're not really provided opportunities to work in the academy because they're winging it essentially because they don't have faculty that support them. And then, the faculty they do have aren't necessarily going to promote them to the next faculty position available. There are some young folks that I know of who have recently gotten faculty positions at universities.
They've broken through the barrier. Yeah, I didn't mean to bring it in terms of that negativity. But as a closing statement, what would you want our listenership to know about working with Native people and working with the kinds of data sets that you've been able to garner and doing preservation archaeology?
Well, it really gets back to something you just mentioned, that rock imagery is really multivalent. We can use it as researchers. We can use it in a multitude of ways to address a whole range of questions, as long as we're open-minded. And those opportunities even become more diverse when we integrate tribal perspectives and opinions into what we do, and it just create better historical research, anthropological research that's equitable as well. My horizons have been opened, much more broadly than they would have otherwise by working with tribes. And the way I study rock imagery now is quite different than I did 10 years ago and quite different than I did 20 years ago, in large part because I've worked with tribes. And there have been some, as with any relationships, there's need to grow and learn. But it's a rewarding endeavor if people's hearts are in the right place.
Yep, it's a journey, and mutual respect and listening is always one of the roots to listening, caring, and respect are some of the key attributes. Dr. Wright, it's been a pleasure. God bless you for participating. I really enjoyed this repartee.
Thank you, Dr. Garfinkel.
God bless you all out there in Rock Art Podcast land. See you on the flip-flop.
Thanks for listening to the Rock Art Podcast with Dr. Alan Garfinkel and Chris Webster. Find show notes and contact information at www.arcpodnet.com/rockart. Thanks for listening, and thanks for sharing this podcast with your family and friends. The Archaeology Podcast Network is 10 years old this year. Our executive producer is Ashley Airy, our social media coordinator is Matilda Siebrecht, and our chief editor is Rachel Roden. The Archaeology Podcast Network was co-founded by Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle in 2014 and is part of Cultural Media and DigTech LLC.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.arcpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.